folk of any locale and any watershed, any background can use in this urgent and essential work of decolonizing our minds and our hearts and our lives and our societies. So for this evening, just a couple of the usual housekeeping details. We are planning on a 90-minute session, so that will be done in an hour and a half. We are planning on recording this, or we are recording, I guess, this session. And so if you don't want your face to be recorded, please turn off your camera. And also please make sure that your microphone remains muted now for the duration of the presentation. We will be having a good time for question and answer later on in the evening. And so I would invite you to send your questions via the chat at any time during the presentation. And so if you've got things you're wondering about, just send them in, we'll keep track, and then we will have opportunity for some Q&A with Elaine and Ched. So at this time, I would like to invite Eileen Clausen-Ham to give a few words of introduction to Elaine and Ched. Eileen has been with MCC for almost 30 years now, and for the past 5 years, she has served as executive director of MCC Saskatchewan. She says that she's served pretty much every position that there has been in this office. So, and she has a long connection, both personal and professional, to this project of healing haunted histories. So Eileen, please.
Thank you, Randy. And good evening, everyone. Oh, let me try again. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to add my welcome to all of you to this circle of learning and imagination. I'm delighted to be here with Elaine and Ched, with the LaFond family, and many other wonderful friends and colleagues. I too am joining you from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, from the watershed of the Saskatchewan rivers, lands that are alive right now with crocus blooms and protective geese, with birch sap and new sage leaves. We are gathered here in the season of Easter, when dead things come alive again, when resurrection surprises us out of our death dealing. Cynthia Wallace, and I saw Cindy on this, she's here somewhere, reminded us earlier this week in her Plowshares article to tip the balance. Cindy this article is focused on the writing of Annie Dillard, and Cindy quoted these words: "Grace is tangled in a rapture with violence." Cindy reminded us that we live within the mysteries of beauty and brutality, and that we're invited to daily actions of repair. She wrote, "We make of our losses a lesson that repairs the world." And this is the beautiful gift that Elaine and Ched have given to us with this writing, a lesson that repairs the world. I'm so grateful to have been part of this conversation with these dear friends through Elaine's doctoral work and now this book project. As I read through the manuscript in the early months of the pandemic, I was again inspired and challenged and reoriented. Elaine and Ched's careful and honest remembering offers us all gifts of discipleship, tools for our repentance, lament, and repair. Elaine and Ched have invited us to deeply engage our landlines, bloodlines, and songlines in the service of deconstruction and decolonization and reconciliation. Reconciliation between settlers and Indigenous peoples, reconciliation within our own bodies and histories. Landlines call us home to our bodies in their spaces, to the stories fused into the Carigana shelter belts, the Saskatoon berry bushes, and the swift flowing rivers. Bloodlines hold our ancestors and our grandbabies. We say their names: Helena Bueller Peters Hebert and Mila Catherine Ham. Their names hold multitudes. And songlines hold the rhythms and words that tether us to redemption, that graciously teach us. despite the trauma, the painful failures, and the violence gathered in our stories. Elaine and Ched, thank you for this good and faithful work, for this beautiful gift of story and altar call. We are grateful to have you come home and to share this evening with us. Please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you, Eileen, Randy, Heather, and MCC Sask, for supporting us and inviting us to do this launch of our new book. And we are so very grateful to all of you who have joined us tonight. I was able to greet some of the many familiar faces and names. And I would love to give a shout out to a number of you, my St. Andrews colleagues, the people that were a part of my research. And again, my research mentor, Sandra Beardsall, and of course, my family members who are on this call tonight. It is deeply meaningful for us to have this opportunity to talk about this book with you all in Saskatchewan, since it is where this project was birthed and takes central stage in the narrative and in my heart. I also want to give a special welcome to Cheryl Bear, DM Lafortune, and Melanie Gleason-Leal, 3 Indigenous friends who are working hard as decolonial educators and artists. And we are so honored tonight to have Mika, Harry, and Germaine Lafond with us, who have contributed to our book and accompanied us on this journey. In a moment, we invite Mika to read one of her poems as an invocation to our comments. Mika Lafond is a member of Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and author of the 2017 poetry collection, Nipewanan, My Way Back, available from Thistledown Press. Her poems and short stories have appeared in a number of Canadian anthologies, and her play, Otachimau, please forgive my pronunciation of Cree, was produced by the Saskatoon Public Division's Indigenous Ensemble. She teaches at the Indian Teacher Education Program at the University of Saskatchewan, where she focuses on adapting curriculum to create a holistic educational experience in the classroom. Welcome, Mika.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I was really honored when you asked to use my poem or part of my poem in the book. So the poem I'm going to share with you, I'm going to share the full poem. A part of it is in the book. It's called My Way Back. It is the title poem for my collection of poetry. And so here we go. My way back. Sitting under a black sky sprinkled with stars, my eyes are called to the ones who have gone before. Late at night, they join hands, brilliant serpentine belt in the northern sky. Purple splashes on green, shawl upon skirt. Great grandmothers, my ancestors loved to dance. I didn't know I could still hear them swishing in the wind, in the solitude of dark. Great grandmothers who danced to a drum only they could hear. Until I sit in silence, thoughts tangled like red willow branches, confusion settling in the roots. I didn't know I could still hear them until I fell away from chaos. My spirit listened, remembered. To view a crimson sunrise, wonder at clouds etched with gold, swim in the deep blues of sky, dance with grass in the wind. I find my way back to the arms of Nokom, my grandmother, my teacher. She shows me silence is a sign of respect. As tobacco burns in the shell, smoke rising, thick at the flame, slowly dissipating until it is scent in the air. Words are spoken in hushed voices, their sacredness not to be shouted. Do not be afraid. In a circle of women, I see myself. They came before me. Their blood is my blood, my ancestors. Silence is a sign of respect. Attitudes can be changed. Pain carried from the past can be let go. All can be forgiven. Kisewato tatuin, one love, all people, all animals, all things. My heartbeat slows, my spirit breathes. In a circle of women, I find myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mika.
Mika, we love that poem, and it is such a fitting and beautiful invocation of our time tonight, a narrative of restoration and healing. Thank you for taking time to share that with us and being with us tonight.
Chad and I are beaming to you from the little town of Oakview, which is halfway up the Ventura River watershed in the Southern California bioregion, which is a secondary study or setting of our book.
Here, native wildflowers such as these California golden poppies are bursting forth throughout our yard despite a drought. This is the heart of traditional and unceded Chumash territory, a community and a legacy to which we as settlers here are responsible. We also recognize that land acknowledgements are only the beginning, not the end, of the long, hard work of decolonization. Tonight, we hope to highlight some themes of our project and then open it up for brief conversation. Feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat at any time. We're going to focus on just two aspects of this rather long book. First, we'll unpack the notion of hauntings as a way of framing the colonial dis-ease among us and within us all. And second, we look at healing as restorative solidarity. These two themes represent the bookends of our narrative, and we'll give you a good sense of what we're wrestling with.
So what do we mean by hauntings? A few years ago, we discovered this graffiti scrawled across a fence just a block from where I grew up in Newtana Park. You will recognize this venerable phrase: as long as the sun shines, grass grows, and the rivers flow. It comes from the Two-Row Wampum of 1613, one of the first agreements made between Indigenous peoples and representatives of a colonial government on Turtle Island, and reiterated in most subsequent agreements in Canada, including Treaty 6. Cree elders use the term Kichi Asotamawatowen to describe sacred promises made to one another in treaty. Yet all over North America, the settler state broke such promises. Thus, our homelands are tattooed by such unsettling hauntings that remind us of unresolved history right up to our present. What's true in my home place is also true in Chad's, a half continent away.
This is a picture of the Gaviota Coast northwest of Santa Barbara, where my family used to camp when I was a teenager. This was and is the heart of Chumash country, the first peoples of this place. We often camped in Tahiguas Canyon, the former site I learned later of the Chumash village of Tahiwa. One year, my dad called our attention to an old coast live oak not far from our campsite. It was adorned with this arbor glyph dating to the early 1800s and thought to be a Chumash rendering of a neophyte that is, someone forcibly taken into the Spanish mission system, kneeling before a Franciscan padre. This was my first exposure as an already alienated teenager growing up in an unchurched home to the heavy footprint of the Spanish colonization of California. Though at the time, we just called it the Indian tree with no further context or conversation. Only much later did I awaken to the true history of my home place, with its layers of Spanish and then Mexican and then American domination, as recently outlined by native Californian Elias Castillo and UCLA historian Benjamin Madley. This fading photo has hung on my walls for decades, haunting me.
Sociologist Avery Gordon, in her important book, Ghostly Matters, asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life, through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with. Slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Yet importantly, Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change, but only if they are faced.
To illustrate what we mean, we need to look no further than the daily news. As you all are aware, here in the US, the murder 11 months ago of George Floyd by a Minneapolis policeman has brought up the ghosts of a long-standing history of violence toward Black and brown bodies in our white-dominant American body politic. This haunting spreads across time and space, even as far away as war-torn Syria. A year's worth of protests paved the way for last week's extraordinary conviction of that policeman. Similarly,
a year ago last week was the anniversary of multiple shootings and fires in the Truro area of Nova Scotia, killing 22 people. We are haunted by such acts of incomprehensible violence, which keep reminding us that our societies are sick. But do we dare explore just how deep our illness goes? Onondaga's scholar Eve Tuck asserts that settler colonialism, which she defines as the management of those who have been made killable and haunting, are inextricably bound. Each ensures there are always more ghosts to return. Indeed, a half millennium of colonization on Turtle Island has left a legacy of violation and genocide that inhabits every intersection of settler and Indigenous worlds, past and present, and which is deeply woven into the fabric of our personal and political lives. Our Healing Haunted Histories tries to look at the deepest layers of hauntings and injustice in our colonial societies in order to encourage, challenge, and capacitate us white settler Christians and other people of faith and conscience to understand how our histories, landscapes, and communities are haunted by the long and continuing history of Indigenous dispossession wrought by settler colonialism. To transform the self-understandings, lifeways, and structures we inhabit, and to practice restorative solidarity with Indigenous communities as part of a wider movement of decolonization. We call this a discipleship of decolonization, which we understand as a thoroughly Anabaptist project, both in its emphasis on commitment to gospel practices of truth and healing, and in its rejection of the notion that the church should identify with an unjust state.
we make theological sense of the phenomenon of haunting that Avery Gordon talks about with a biblical analogy. We think that the ghostly matters analyzed by Gordon is akin to what the ancient healer Jesus of Nazareth diagnosed and engaged as unclean spirits. The Gospels portrayed Rabbi Jesus as unmasking two kinds of oppressive spirits. On one hand, Jesus confronted what we might call political demons. We see this, for example, in the story in Mark 5 about the Gerasene demoniac, who is unmasked as the spirit of the Roman legion, who occupied Palestine in Jesus' time. These demons are drowned in the sea, just like Pharaoh's army in the old Exodus story. On the other hand, Jesus' exorcisms also focused on the internal oppression of marginalized persons, as in the example of a spirit of silencing in Luke 11 that rendered its victim unable to either speak or hear.
As anthropologist Thomas Sortus notes, a central element of haunting is secrecy, where the secret may be shameful, not yet speakable. We think of how our colleagues in the Black Lives Matter movement talk about the need for white folk to break our silence, and the need for communities of color to refuse to be silenced regarding past and present racist violence. This is why the BLM movement often uses the mantra, "Say their names," as shorthand for finding one's voice to resist the erasure of victims, just as the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls movement does here in Canada and in the US.
So Jesus unsilences those whose psyches and communities are possessed and lands occupied by unclean spirits, hauntings, because that is the only way they can be healed. We suggest that arguably Jesus' strangest parable speaks poignantly to the work of getting to the root of these diseases. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it wanders through waterless regions looking for a resting place. Not finding any, it says, "I will return to my house from which I came." And when it comes, it finds it swept and put in order. So it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and live there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. Admittedly, this is pretty strange stuff to our modern ears, but not for more traditional societies.
Jesus is inviting disciples to journey deep into the layers of our captivity and conformity, an archaeology of self and society. But he is also warning that the way to freedom will be much more difficult and protracted than we can imagine. As Carl Jung famously put it, the right way to wholeness is made up of fateful detours and wrong turnings. It is the longissima via, not straight, but snake-like. A path whose labyrinthine twists and turns are not lacking in terrors. Jesus, too, knew that the forces of control within us and around us will come back 7 times stronger. This resonates with anyone who has tried to overcome personal addiction or to free their community from political oppression. In our work, we use the metaphor of peeling the proverbial onion 7 layers down with all the accompanying tears. The hauntings go that deep in our individual and collective spirits. Liberation is not about instantaneous deliverance, but about a lifelong journey of discipleship.
Fortunately, the Gospels portray the healer Jesus not as a socializing physician, that is, patching people up so they can carry on with the status quo and business as usual, but rather as a radical doctor who seeks out the roots of the disease. There is only one requirement. We must admit to ourselves and to each other that we are, in fact, unhealthy, personally and politically. To borrow from 12-step language, we must recognize the lethality of our disease and turn to a power greater than our own, in this case, the gospel as strong medicine. Only if and when we settlers recognize, therefore, that the killing system of white supremacy and colonialism is also killing us, will we join the movement to repent, which is biblical language, which means turn our history around.
We long for our faith communities to be places where we white settlers can nurture the courage to peel the onion 7 layers down, to learn to feel the pain of our entanglements in racism and colonization, past and present, and to heal. The emotional labor of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks having to share their pain so we can get it is too costly. Our work cannot be sustained on other people's hurt, nor on their strength. A discipleship of decolonization is our onion to peel.
For us, an important part of this work is to critically trace our family lines in order to understand how we are products of historical processes of violence and dispossession. So in this book, we discuss tools for exploring our family and communal histories, tracing and analyzing place, people, and spirit, what we call our storylines. We refer to these strands of communal narrative as Eileen put it, landlines, meaning past and present places of inhabitation, bloodlines, that is our family and community, race and ethnicity, and songlines, liberative traditions that inspire practices of justice and compassion. Our book tries to map how readers can explore, interrogate, and decolonize these strands. And it uses Elaine's family and communal storylines as the central example.
The backbone narrative of this book is thus about my Ruslander grandparents and their community's flight from Russia and Ukraine in the wake of the Bolshevik and Stalinist violence, and their settlement on the Canadian prairies in the 1920s. We explore how over the centuries, Anabaptist dissent, displacement, and periodic persecution marginalized our people on one hand, but on the other, how we often negotiated certain privilegia from the colonial powers and how we assimilated into white advantages over time. Our traumatized Ruslander immigrant ancestors settled in Saskatchewan, or most of them did, where Mennonite farmers were actively recruited by the Canadian government as a buffer population to help domesticate the prairies and settle Indigenous land. In this process, nearby Indigenous communities were being displaced and suffering from even more trauma because of ongoing colonial policies of dispossession and suppression. So 2 haunted communities struggled to survive side by side with little connection between them until recently, as Indigenous hospitality and activism and Mennonite efforts at solidarity are beginning to change the story.
Remarkably, half a century ago, sociologist Leo Dreger courageously summed up the dilemma of our complicity, a word that simply means entanglement, in an article in the Mennonite Quarterly Review. When hunters and trappers had been cleared away, he wrote, referring to both Russia and Canada, Mennonites moved in. It was a struggle between the food gatherers and the food growers. The Mennonites were part of a farming invasion. How, he continued, could non-resistant Mennonite minorities benefit from lands and protection secured by government through war and violence without compromising their basic principles?
These are hard questions. And I am so grateful to my relatives and ancestors for curating our stories and practicing Mennonite survivance. And our long-term health as a community requires us also to explore how we were and are entangled, however unwittingly, in colonial policies of white supremacy and oppression, and how to make things right. Now, this Bloodlines work can sometimes feel like doing surgery on living flesh. Exploring one's family and community tradition requires care, especially regarding trauma, whose psychological and physiological footprints in our Ruslander community and descendants include disproportionate rates of anxiety and depression. So we must engage our history both critically and compassionately. A discipleship of decolonization invites us to reread our people's stories mindfully, with a commitment to healing and restorative solidarity. This is what the great writer activist Audre Lorde called doing our own work. And our book is a portrait of me trying to do that work.
Now, of course, settlers, most of us, we prefer to avoid this kind of hard work. And here we'll mention just two of the ways that we typically try to exonerate ourselves from responsibility, of the many ways that we explore in the book. The most endemic strategy is to presume our settler innocence through what three Canadian scholars call colonial agnosian. This is not, they argue, simply a matter of collective amnesia or omission. Rather, this act of ignoring is aggressively reproduced, affectively invested, meaning it inhabits our emotions and spirituality, and effectively distributed through our educational systems and media in ways that justify the status quo and render our entanglements in colonization just too difficult to understand. In other words, we don't know about the past and continuing injustices, and actually we don't really want to know.
Another widespread move to innocence is disassociation, embracing an ahistorical individualism, understanding ourselves as free-floating entities, untethered and unaccountable to a past which is not our fault. Two other Canadian theorists call this transcendent denial, a foreclosure of knowledge in which the settler must believe that history is in the past and that any and all harm, trauma, and associated accountability is irrelevant. As a result, they assert, we are literally sick at heart and soul, making it difficult to look at each other or ourselves without weariness, which extends to all those we encounter as other.
One of our teachers is the American writer James Baldwin, whose way of putting it we find profound. White people, he wrote, are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until we understand it, we cannot be released from it. And then he reminds us that to reckon with this history is not to drown in shame or paralysis or denial, but rather to use it for liberation. Because, he warned, an invented past cannot help us. It will crumble under the pressure of reality.
Contemporary Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez summarizes the whole matter simply and succinctly. This history is not your fault, she says, but it is absolutely your responsibility. So how do we develop this ability to respond? The goal of our project is not to focus on the past, but to animate and empower settlers in personal and political practices of restorative solidarity, going forward as a path of healing hauntings. By restorative solidarity, we mean the work of applying principles of restorative justice to historic injustices, and it consists of three interrelated commitments.
First, to do our own work around issues like agnosia and dissociation, white fragility, ethnic loss and assimilation, and entanglement in and the impact of intergenerational trauma and moral injury in order to understand our own deformation by and entanglement in the legacy and structures of settler colonialism.
And 2, to listen to how Indigenous and other communities victimized by historic and current injustices are identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities, and investigating our complicity.
And then to work with these communities, a little trigger happy there.
No, other way, baby.
Okay, well, we're just gonna leave that alone. To work with these communities to make things right as possible, including covenants of accountability, restitution, reparation, repatriation, and perhaps over time, reconciliation. This process is an ongoing circle. As soon as we take initiative, we go back over what we have learned, then have conversation about next steps, and keep working around these practices.
Like many of you, we appreciate Roger Epps' popularization of our settler responsibility to be treaty people, which has spread widely in Canada. So in the last little part of our presentation, we'll briefly explore 4 aspects of restorative solidarity as outlined in our Healing Haunted Histories. So 1 is revisioning our colonial legacy and identity. 2 is relationship building with Indigenous communities, especially our neighbors. 3 is restorative actions that support work for Indigenous justice. And 4 is reparative experiments. And we will give brief examples of each aspect.
Since 2007, our annual Bartimaeus Institutes have sought to create a space for reschooling ourselves, offering instruction, inspiration, and empowerment that engages not only our heads, but also our hearts, hands, and spirits. We focus on critical immersion in the landlines, bloodlines, and songlines of our faith traditions, especially scripture, of exemplary social movements, historical and contemporary, and of our own lives.
Here we gather with kindred spirits to do serious work at the intersection of sanctuary, seminary, streets, and soil. We even held an institute in Saskatchewan in 2016 focused on the TRC calls to action for churches, which some of you helped us with. And we always have a small cohort of Canadians who join us in sunny California in the 3rd week of February. So we hope some of you might consider coming in 2022.
Shameless promotion.
Shameless. Curating such spaces is crucial so that we white settler Christians and others can deepen our journeys from denial to a discipleship of healing hauntings. And we urge you to participate in the many ways that MCC Sask also hosts such gatherings. These spaces motivate us to engage more deeply in the next 3 aspects of restorative solidarity. Harry Lafond emphasizes that relationship is essential to solidarity. This former chief of the Muskeg Lake Cree Band needs no introduction to you. I first got to know Harry through MCC Sask, with whom he has long collaborated, and he graciously accompanied my research. During workshops with my Prairie Mennonite community, many of you that are a part of this tonight, in 2014, this beloved elder listened carefully as we struggled to engage our history. And at the end of each session, he would respond with stories from his own family and community, as he will do again tonight at the close of our presentation. Harry and his beloved wife, Germaine, are also well known around the province for how they have welcomed settlers to Muskeg Lake and built intercultural relations. And so, Harry, can you share a story or 2 about how you've worked to build Indigenous settler relations?
Well, first of all, kitamskat na all. They me also no kapik squatameg. Me also met ka wichi Goichi Daswak, she soma Gwyn Stotamak, and is Motea. We welcome this opportunity to our territory, Treaty 6 territory. Our ancestors lived here for a few hundred years. And when we think about reconciliation, the word itself has taken on many directions since the TRC. It has become a word that many people are exploring and seeking to find meaning for themselves inside of that word. And it's no different for us from Muskeg Lake. Reconciliation calls to us like it does everyone else in this country or on this planet. It calls to us, it pulls us towards a renewed understanding of who we are as a people. We struggle, however. We struggle because the colonial attitudes that persist in governments and institutions and in our neighbors prevent us from becoming full partners in seeking a new relationship. And in our culture, the Cree culture, the word Wakotuin is our foundation. We believe that Mamuyo Tawima, the father of all, the creator, calls our community to focus their attention on connecting with ourselves, our families, our communities, and our neighbors, and to do it in a way that engenders and respects the gifts of each individual. It's in that spirit that we've spent some time in our community looking at how do we become Treaty 6 people in its fullest sense. And it's been part of my family's way of looking at themselves in trying to determine what can we do inside of our communities to show our neighbors who and many times are afraid of us. They're afraid because they don't know anything about us. The education systems have deliberately been very silent about the indigenous peoples of this country and has not allowed knowledge and awareness and understanding to develop in our children. And so that's been the fun part of being good neighbors, is reaching out to especially the Mennonites. And this is the sort of the accidental encounter with Elaine and the work that she's doing that drew me into really pursuing this inside of my community. And every little step counts, every little effort counts, and that's what we need to remember. It doesn't have to be a great big project. Sometimes it's just a manageable little project has its dividends, and I've seen it. I've been I've been encountering with the Mennonite community and other communities, the people from Africa, several groups from Africa and the Chinese coming out into our community. And I've seen the changed awakening among people. Just coming onto the reserve has allowed them to eat, to dance, to sing, to pray with us. And you can't give anything more meaningful than that. And really, part of our challenge here in Muskeg has been exactly what this book is about. It's finding out who we are, because we also need to acknowledge that we displaced somebody when we settled here 300 years ago. We displaced somebody, and some of that is slowly being unraveled, and steps are being taken to mend fences between the Cree people, Cree communities, and Siksika people from around Calgary. And to a certain extent, the people to the south of us, the Gros-Ventre and the indigenous people of Montana and Dakotas. So that's part of our challenge, our reconciliation. We have to do the same work that the Mennonites and other groups have to do for themselves, so that we can be good neighbors, so we can connect, and so we can deepen our efforts for relationship building. So thank you very much for this work that you're doing. I think will make a difference among the people who encounter your work, and don't keep it going. Keep talking about it, and we'll do our part as part of your team. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. We are so glad we are part of your team. That is wonderful.
And those, many of you who know Germaine and Harry, know how incredibly hospitable they are in welcoming people to Muskeg Lake and to going out to communities to build relationship. And it's that relationship building which is absolutely essential. Nothing else makes sense without it. Thirdly, it's crucial that we settlers, as we learn about and learn to listen to Indigenous communities, also show up in meaningful ways to support, accompany, and stand with communities engaged in righting historical wrongs. We work a lot with young faith-rooted activists for whom this is a priority. For example, Brenna Cusson, a settler Catholic worker in Wisconsin, participates in the annual Women in Water Coming Together Symposium held at an Ojibwe reservation. It is a 5-day gathering of Native and non-Native participants animated by Ojibwe elder Mary Baker, who gathers Indigenous speakers to teach in a traditional way the importance of healing ourselves and the earth, particularly through the sacred relationships between women and water. Brenna supports the logistical organizing of this gathering and helps lead workshops and immersive experiences for white settler descendant participants around decolonization.
There are many pressing issues around which Indigenous communities are looking for settler support. In both of our countries, resource extraction is one fraught area of contestation. From Standing Rock to Wet'suwet'en, as you no doubt know, Steve Heinrichs, Director for Indigenous Settler Relations for Mennonite Church Canada, has been active in demonstrations around pipeline justice, such as a nonviolent action at the Kinder Morgan facility at Burnaby Mountain in 2018. The group pictured here, which includes another friend of ours, Anglican priest Laurel Dykstra, were responding to an invitation to religious leaders from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation to oppose the pipeline project. The carbon economy and its infrastructure has always had disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities. And in our era of climate crisis, these issues, no matter how contentious, will not go away.
Ultimately, our practices of decolonization must lead to retributive justice, including reparations. Talk about contentious. But the healing that we're looking for, part of that is to keep in mind that of the total landmass of both Canada and the US, Indigenous reserves and reservations constitute only 0.2% today. This is why repatriation of land and life is considered the essence of decolonization by many Indigenous leaders. And recently we've seen this popularized in the land back movement. Moreover, for us Christians, the gospel story of Jesus and the rich man makes it clear that returning what has been taken by fraud is a precondition for the discipleship of the wealthy and for our healing. This is a text we discuss at length in the book. And we know that talk of reparations spikes our settler anxieties, and that our communities and institutions typically dismiss it as too complicated or unrealistic. But we Christians can and must think and organize together with Indigenous colleagues concerning power, money, and land justice. This isn't just about farmland. We all live on Indigenous lands, rural and urban, including our churches. With a dwindling congregation, Stony Point Presbyterian Church made the difficult decision to close its doors in fall 2017. This is in New York. But this led to a concrete gesture of relational repatriation. In 2016, the Presbyterian Church USA General Assembly had repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and its General Assembly called on all levels of the PCUS to enter into dialogue, strategy, and action with Indigenous people of the region as part of a process of confession and repentance to redress wrongs. So our friend Rick Ufford Chase, pictured here, former denominational moderator, proposed to Stony Point Press that they explore with local Indigenous leaders a possible handover of that property. Discussions with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Wampanoag Lenape Nation culminated in a November 2019 turnover of this former Stony Point Church and all its property to the newly created Sweetwater Cultural Center to promote the education, health, and welfare of Native peoples and to preserve their culture and ceremonial practices. This gesture has deepened the relationships between local Presbyterians and Ramapo Lenape folk.
Recent grassroots experiments in voluntary taxing as civil society reparations are another expression. The Sogoreate Land Trust is an intertribal organization led by Indigenous women in Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it is working to rematriate urban land where Ohlone ancestors can be properly reinterred. Since every one of the 425 shell mounds, the sacred burial grounds around the bay, have been destroyed by developments. Some local settlers initiated the Shumi land tax, a voluntary payment to help support Sogoreate's work. So participants calculate the annual voluntary tax based on their rent or land value. This is an exciting experiment, and similar symbolic tax initiatives have sprung up in Seattle and New York City. We haven't talked this evening about Stony Knoll of Washtenaw, because we trust that you, at least in Saskatchewan, but I think Mennonites across Canada, are following the work of MCC Sask and others on these issues. But we did want to give a couple of minutes to Ray Funk, who has been instrumental in the continuing conversation between MCC, local landowners, and tribal members regarding Washtenaw. As you know, Ray helped inaugurate the Spruce River Folk Festival, an annual music and cultural event on his farm, which educates about landless bands within Saskatchewan. And proceeds of this delightful festival, which we were able to attend in 2019, go to support the Young Chippewayan land claim and reconciliation efforts. So Ray, yes, Ray, please give us an update.
Okay, yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Elaine, my almost cousin, and greetings to everybody else in this very large gathering, whether you're related or not. And I certainly hope that Elaine and Ched feel properly affirmed by this the viral participation that we're seeing tonight, and it's most astounding and very well deserved. It's a wonderful book, and we look forward to the opportunities we might have to dig further into this, hopefully in the near future. And thanks as well to MCC for putting this event together. I think it demonstrates the commitment of MCC to take a new look at our own stories and to lead some of the braiding work, which will follow inevitably in the wake of this book. My agent says I have only a few minutes to talk, so I did write it down, and I am starting with the easy part. I'm pleased to tell you that while Spruce River Folk Fest may be gone for another year because of COVID, it is not forgotten. The place is still here. That's where I've got to wait out the COVID experience, and couldn't be a better place. So people will be invited back summer of 22. A group of us around the home base here in PA are already looking to what it'll take to bring that together. And our partners, MCC and MC Sask, are still with us, as well as some new partners from the area. So we're really looking forward to that, and also very encouraged that by the fact that when I encounter somebody and on the street in Saskatoon or in church or whatever, the first thing they normally say after hello is, "When is Folk Fest?" And so we're very much affirmed by that. The question of the ongoing settler young Chippewayan relationship is, of course, a much bigger and complex question. Compared to what things looked like in the Reserve 107 movie that, the stills of which opened this segment, it can probably be said that the interactive part of that relationship is in time of transition. COVID has played a massive role in that, and I think that's everyone can relate to. That's particularly true because there have been changes in leadership among both the Young Chippewayan and MCC, and the passing away of the legendary Rory Hokwats during this time when it's very hard to communicate, especially for people that communicate best in person. And there simply hasn't been a chance to develop the depth of relationship that existed in what now looks like the golden age of the Reserve 107 movie. However, I think there really is a felt need all around that we need to not particularly re-engage, we are engaged, but to really re-engage with some vigor. The story doesn't feel finished to anybody. And I know that the Randy and the team at MCC are fully committed, including being willing to explore the creation of a land trust or historical trust in some form or other that fits our circumstances. And I just in the last day talked to Freddie Sasakamusa's son, Neil, and Hereditary Chief George Kingfisher, and as well as my cousin Bomer Fraze at Laird. And of course, Wilmer. And two things came of that. I learned that some of the details of the recognition that the federal government has afforded the young Chippewyans 1885 annuity claim. They were, one of the things that really put them in the ditch was when they were found to be what was called a rebel band after 1885. And their lawyer, Ron Maurice, or the case, Beardy's, and there were repercussions, severe repercussions. Beardy's felt it the worst. They had no chief of their own until 1920. And so Beardy's sued, but because it cost so much, they gathered up everybody else that had been wrong during that experience and added them to the suit, including the young Chippewayan, which was a bit of a mischievous maneuver. In that when the case was found, it was accepted and then judged in favor, there was young Chippewayan at the end of the list. Young Chippewayan, the lawyer, filed a claim on their behalf using the Atakakoop First Nation as the trustee and to give it legal status. And they just got word that they have been recognized. And now, of course, the challenge is to get organized to negotiate. So there's a lot of internal capacity building and work that will need to be done in the meantime. So I won't give into or go into the details, but it could be a sum of several $1 million. So it's substantial. And when both of these gentlemen heard that I was going to be calling them really at this time to get their input into my thinking here, they both urged us to not back away, to see the story as continuing, and to recognize that the relationship could well be moving into new possibilities through thought, through action, the work you're doing, and to take our responsibility to history serious and pass that on to future generations. And Rory Hokotz, before he died, he blessed our efforts and urged us to continue on and to take the long view, which we're trying to do. And then George Kingfisher, he wished God's blessing to rest upon our friendship to eternity. So I think that's a good way to end.
Lovely.
Oh,
Thank you, Ray.
thank you, Ray.
Appreciate that so very much. That's a great update. And you can get more information from MCC Sask on any of that. It's a really important case of reparation and reparative justice. But none of the examples, and many more in the book, of restorative solidarity among settlers are heroic. Attending demonstrations or modest redistributions of settler surplus, these are hardly costly. But such experiments represent beginning steps in a longer journey. And Ray and folks at Sowing Oil have been at this for decades. Small steps animate more substantial efforts, but we must be persistent as settlers because this is about our healing too. But we'll have to get used to working with questions that have no clear, much less easy answers. And that's something that is very difficult for us managerial-minded settlers. Mohawk educator Tayayak Alfred sums it up this way: for all of us, Indigenous and settler alike, there is only self-questioning and embracing this commitment. Listen to the voices of our Indigenous ancestors channeled through the young people of our nations. Learn from Indigenous culture how to walk differently and love the land as best you can. Friends, colleagues, we believe this journey of decolonizing discipleship can heal us, heal our churches, heal our haunted history, and lead us into a redeemed future of justice for all. We want to turn it back to our elder Harry Lafon to conclude this presentation with whatever part of his afterword in the book he wishes to share.
There we go. It was another ordinary Sunday meal some years ago. The remains of a delicious roasted chicken on the table, surrounded by piles of little drumstick bones. My sister was home for a weekend visit from Edmonton, and lots of little stories were going around the table, with laughter and the odd teasing about her husband's fading hockey career. The stories often cycled back to the history of our Métis families. Mama, did you know your dad? She asked my mother. Pegonestong ginakskawa mittenik giapsishin. Duck Lake miaman ekte magazine ki paminam. I met him only once when I was a little girl. He ran a store in Duck Lake. Mama came from a Métis family, its origins somewhere south of Winnipeg, with later connections to the Batoche people. She spoke very little English, never having felt the need to learn it. School was not an option for her. She learned to maneuver her way comfortably using her Michif language and oral training. She raised a family of 12 children, to whom she told many stories about her grandfather, Jonas, a restless buffalo hunter and a veteran of the Batoche resistance. She grew up under his loving care and honed her skill to tell stories with detail and humor. Mama's simple and honest statement about her slivered relationship to her dad caught my imagination and eventually found its way into my heart. Who was this man? The grandfather we could only imagine. How had his absence impacted our identity as a family? Is it possible to connect to our grandfather long gone to the spirit world? Armed with these questions and picking some up more along the way, I set out to find answers, dragging my family with me. Some were interested, others just noted the little tidbits of information uncovered on the journey. This grandfather's only presence was his tombstone at Elmwood Graveyard in Winnipeg, and a picture at Batoche Museum showing a marked resemblance to some of my siblings, including his blue eyes. In my Cree world, the present is comfortably ensconced in the circle of life between past and future. In our Kehir-Whatston school, we teach our children and grandchildren how to participate in a feast ceremony at least once every season of the year. This is our way of teaching the importance of sustaining relationships with the ancestors, Anskuchapanak. The ribbons of memory tying us to them are sustained through the food we share, the pipe we smoke, the cloth we bring to the sweat ceremony, and the offerings we gather for the ancestors. This is the keystone of our identity as Cree people. It is no wonder then that my heart feels the gaps of a lost grandfather and a need to close them, to ensure my grandchildren can experience a balanced family tree. Experience has taught me that a leaning tree falls under the force of a strong wind. I have been fortunate to be curious about people's histories, especially those of my community of Muskeg Lake, and to have had some resources to pursue the many paths of that curiosity. Others have not been so fortunate, haunted by the trauma brought into the lives of their grandparents when settlers arrived, by government attempts at genocide and or assimilation, and by churches' collusion in the attempts to eradicate Cree institutions, which have left them with a broken understanding of their own identity and history. The overwhelming fog of unknowing, punctuated by brain-changing trauma, brings into a family an utter sadness, devoid of deep love, and so we reset, and reset inside ourselves, our families, and our communities. We work to instill the curiosity needed to seek family ties and to understand Cree teachings of love, compassion, empathy, and identity. Saskatchewan, finding your center. In our community, we have established the Wahkotuin, seeking to be related. This is an advisory committee. The healing process has moved from a wish list to an action list. Everyone recognizes the committee by its powerful name, and Wahkotuin has become everyday language. Where does that leave my grandfather and me? The outline of the man my mama met only once is beginning to take on substance and color. We met when I visited his home in Duck Lake. An elderly woman, formerly of Duck Lake, pointed out the house to me. Then on 3 occasions, I visited his grave in Elmwood and introduced myself. Later, I brought my youngest son and 2 grandsons to meet their Anskuchapan, great-grandfather. With each visit, a sense of familiarity grows. In the spirit of the feast ceremony, my maternal grandfather is beginning to find his place with my paternal grandfathers, Andre and J.B. Lafond. 4 of us, including my sister, made a trip to Germany to visit the small village that his grandfather's family left to come to Canada. Slowly, the family tree is growing straighter. At every opportunity, I bring his presence into family events to help the children of my siblings get to know their Anskuchapan. Canada has been on a rocky journey over the last 10 years, trying to respond to the 94 calls to action issued by the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These are intended to guide us on our way across a map of recollection from sea to sea to sea. It is rocky because, as usual, people want shortcuts. But there is no shortcut to a lasting long-term relationship between Indigenous and settler communities. Each of us is called to remember the past, live the present, and set the framework for the next 7 generations. And that will only happen under the spiritual nudging of Mamuyo Tawimau, God, the Father of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, for that beautiful benediction to tonight's program, but also to our book. It is such a beautiful exploration of landlines, bloodlines, and songlines that you have gifted to us. So thank you for all you do and are in this common work. Before we turn it back to Randy for some conversation, I want to put this before you. If you would like to order a copy of Healing Haunted Histories, please go to Common Word Books, which in partnership with MCC Canada is offering it already at a discount. And in support of the program for tonight, they have told us that if you order your copy by Sunday, you can get an additional 15% off. So that is a big support from Common Word and from Mennonite Church Canada, only through Sunday. Thank you so much, all of you, for your interest in this project. And Randy, let us open it up.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Elaine and Ched. Thank you, Harry and Ray and Mika, for the words that you've brought into here. We've got lots of good questions. We are at this place where we know either we look at all the good questions or we end at 8:30, but it's not going to be both. So we will take it as it comes. But I want to start with a question that came early on, and from Melanie Campen. Let's see here. Yeah, thanks so much for your work. One of the questions, or she puts out the question, I was wondering if you cover Mennonite involvement in Indian residential schools in Canada, since Poplar Hills was included in the settlement agreement.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. Of course, we do deal with Indian residential schools at length, but we only reference Mennonite involvement. So you won't find lots in there about specifically Mennonite involvement, but we certainly do work with Indian residential schools and our responsibility to them and impact on Indigenous communities.
Great dissertation topic, Melanie.
Yeah, go Melanie.
That's great. Okay, this one's a little bit more, it's a broad question, but I definitely think that there are parts of your book that deal with this. The question comes from Therese, and thank you, Therese. I'm not sure who or where you are, but how do you manage anger in this process? Because you're dealing with so much internal stuff and external injustice. How do you handle the anger?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, you want to go?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's obviously a huge question. It's a question for all of us, both as individuals and as communities. It's important, psychologically speaking, that our anger be channeled into constructive engagement and not deteriorate into rage, because rage tends to eat us up and deform us. There's lots to be angry about, but ultimately anger is a life force that needs to be channeled. And that is why it's so important from our perspective that all of this work be framed in a spiritual, in terms of spiritual disciplines, or what we call discipleship, that managing anger, frustration, disappointment, loss, unknowing are all aspects of this work that we have to figure out how to metabolize and turn toward healing. So it takes there's a lot of inner work as well as all of the outer work we've mostly been focused on.
And I thank you for that question. And, you know, I don't know your growing up, but I think some of us certainly raised in the white perfectionist culture aren't allowed to be angry. And so recognizing that and naming that, and then being in relationships that give you life, that you can talk about ways to undo the violence, the injustice that is you are feeling that rage against, is an important piece. You know, we are grateful for our larger community that comes together, and we laugh a lot, and we struggle really hard with our own complicity in white supremacy, and our sorrow and anger about what is happening to Indigenous and other marginalized community, and we also dance. We have a dance party because you got to get in your body and move to get that rage going.
Especially with Harry.
Especially with Harry.
He does a mean jig.
Mean jig. Wow. You all should have seen it. It was beautiful.
That's awesome. I, as I was hearing you say that, I was thinking, I wonder what the connection is, or how do you understand the connection between song lines, which is a significant part of your work, and dealing with anger. But I mean, you brought it there in terms of dance. And I know there are some Mennonites for whom like song works and dance doesn't, and others that have learned to integrate that.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, songlines is a really important strand of this book, and it's different for a lot of different communities and individuals, but absolutely essential to know what gives us life and what keeps us going.
Question came in from Moses here. As someone who's been shaped by individualism that dissociates me from my and our past, I can appreciate the need to do the required work to know my story. It may even excite me, but for many people I talk to, doing any work at all seems too daunting, boring, or unimportant. So what do you do when the gospel story or even an appeal to human rights is not enough to persuade people to enter into this work? What have you found to be a helpful catalyst in getting people involved?
For us, we think there are multiple catalysts which are essential. Song lines are one of them. They're the things that animate us, the things that give us hope, the things that give us energy, who tell us who we are. Another catalyst is face-to-face encounter with people who have been on the business end of oppression, not dealing with abstract issues, but with that relational thing that Harry was talking about. That is a huge motivator. And at the end of the day, and we've tried to stress it a lot tonight, to have a commitment to our own healing. As we all know, in addiction and recovery work, nobody can make an addict get sober through mere exhortation. There's got to be a commitment to one's own healing. And that's why all of this work is about our healing and the healing of our relations. So I think those three things are what I would.
Yeah. And I do feel, storytelling and building relationships, as Ched was saying, hearing from folks directly, folks from marginalized communities, folks that are working toward justice. But then I also always want to say we have to do our own work around these stories of pain, and not rely only on other people's stories. But that is a way that can help us understand the depth and breadth of the illness of our societies here in Canada and the US.
And frankly, what we're discovering in workshops and the feedback we're getting from people reading and using the book is that there's a lot of energy around discovering one's family and communal history. This is not as acutely true of European Mennonites, who tend to have a higher degree of knowledge of their genealogies, but for most settler North Americans, it's just a vacuous void. People don't know who they are. And so there's a lot of energy right now, particularly among young people, of delving into family history. And that's another source of engagement that can motivate folk.
Thanks for that. Here's another question that has come in here. In my experience, it's difficult for many Mennonites to accept, understand, be curious about, and respect the spiritual elements that are woven into Indigenous worldviews as they are in Mennonite worldviews. This seems to be a barrier for Mennonites being willing or able to build reciprocal and respectful relationships with Indigenous neighbors where I live. Did that come up in your research at all? Do you have wisdom around working with Mennonites who have superior beliefs about their religious convictions?
Well, of course, superiority is part of white supremacy, right? That notion of spiritual or economic or ethnic superiority, all of those things are part of the poison that compromises the gospel and makes us unhealthy. And this is a work we have to do in all of our churches, but not just our churches. There are all kinds of elements of our settler society that are steeped in attitudes of entitlement and superiority, and just who can't be bothered learning a deeper, older wisdom of Indigenous peoples. So as in all spiritual renewal, humility, a degree of humility and curiosity is the beginning of wisdom and the beginning of healing. And that's, again, why this is a matter of conversion for us to commit ourselves to expanding our sense of how God works in the world. And we think that that is going to be crucial to spiritual conversation between communities. And unless and until any of our churches or any of our other communities engage in that, we'll be talking past one another, or we won't be talking at all.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's ironic that, I mean, in a faith and a religious system that says pride is the chief sin,
Yeah.
that is what infects us the most. I am grateful for Eileen's question. I think this is a wonderful closing question here. How has this research and writing project brought healing to your lives?
Thank you, Eileen. Well, I don't know if I think my sister Janet is still on this call, but Janet and I went to Ukraine in 2010. And that is when this project was not birthed. I think it has been growing in me for a very, very long time. And I do see it that I am carrying on the work of my ancestors and my parents, birthed in 2010, and the gift of being able to go to Ukraine and see where our grandparents were from, and then to work with the incredible people that joined me in my DMIN research, and hearing their stories and their vulnerability. And it was mostly settler Mennonite women. Those conversations are healing as we recognize ourselves in each other's stories, and we name some of the things that maybe we haven't been courageous enough to name. And these women did that work. Certainly another piece of healing has been learning the history, and not enough of it, but starting to learn the history of Saskatchewan and the Indigenous reality and dispossession that I didn't learn. And we know this, I did not learn that in the education system. And then also to learn this history of where we live here now, and building relationship with the Chumash people. And so that has just all been, I think, healing, certainly on a soul, spirit level, but on a physical level too. I think it is all related, and I'm very grateful for the folks that have accompanied me on this journey.
No, I'm mindful of the time. I just want to say how healing it is to me as a non-Cradle Mennonite, non-Canadian, to have this wonderful world opened up to me, and to be able to call friends like you, colleagues in this work. We're so grateful for MCC Sask to invite us to this banquet tonight. And we're so grateful for all of you who have tuned in. We really look forward to how all of us deepen in this work, layer by layer, down into the healing, down into the restoration. So thanks so much, Randy, Eileen, Harry and Jermaine, Mika, Heather, all of y'all. Ray, baby.
Well, thank you so much, Chad and Elaine. This has been just a remarkable, a very rich evening. We're grateful. It's clear. I am about 95%, 96% through the book, and but it deserves going through a couple more times. Like, this is a workbook. It's clear that it's a labor of love, and it's a labor of anguish, and it's a labor of hope. And so grateful for the gift that you have given for all who are interested in this discipleship of decolonization. So thank you so much. Thank you again to Harry, to Mika, to Ray, Eileen, for your contributions this evening, for all of you that have contributed questions. And sorry, there might be one or two that we haven't been able to get to, but we'll make sure that you can, you can find Chad and Elaine online at the Bartimaeus Institute. We also will put in a couple more links in the chat, so that you've seen the generous discount that Common Word is offering up until Sunday. So
Thank you, Arlen.
Yes.
Pardon?
Thank you, Arlen.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Arlen. Thank you, Common Word there. And if you happen to not be in Canada, you can go to the healinghauntedhistories.org website and find the publishers there, Whips and Stock. So MCC Saskatchewan does have a few more resources to keep you informed and involved in this journey. And again, Heather's got the links there. There's a podcast. We've got 2 seasons and counting of Reconcile, everyday conversations. The study guide is out for the first season, and second season will be coming out next month. If you have not seen the documentary Reserve 107, it's a remarkable film. It's a half-hour that's free online, and it would encourage you to watch that story. As Ray said, it was released 5 years ago, and there are many changes that have happened since then, but it's a profound story to be aware of. So if you haven't seen that, please take opportunity to watch that. And then from our Ottawa office, there's a resource page for understanding and supporting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So would invite you to, I'm sure many of you are already doing all kinds of research, aware of that, but would invite you to engage there and to stay informed there. And there's more that we would love to share with you. And so we would invite you to stay current with us on social media, Facebook and Instagram, and a newsletter. Heather's got the link there as well. So thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And I pray that you've been enriched and challenged, that you've been equipped and inspired to live towards a better future where Indigenous and settler folk will live as true neighbors according to the spirit and intent of the treaties.
They have plates there.
It's a sign that we're done. So thank you so much, friends. This has been wonderful.
Randy, thank you so very much. Thank you so much, Randy. Again, Eileen, Heather, Harry and Jermaine and Mika and Ray, thank you all. And thanks to all you folks that have joined us.
We look forward to the end of, when travel will be able to happen more openly, and especially cross-border California to Canada. So,
yes, we really hope to be up in Saskatchewan. As soon as we can come, we will. It's been 2 years, a long time.
Amen. Yeah, amen. Okay, thank you to all of you once again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.